Welcome to this Talks at Google virtual event. I'm Caitlin Venezia, and I'm a recruiter on the People Operations team here at Google. Before we get started, I want to remind our audience today that we'll be taking questions towards the end of the talk. So as you think of questions throughout the conversation, please feel free to add them to the live chat on the right. I am so excited to introduce today's guest, Russell Foster. Russell Foster is a professor of circadian neuroscience. He is the head of Oxford's Nuffield Laboratory of Ophthalmology, and he's the founder and director of the Sleep and Circadian Research Institute. His research dives into how circadian rhythms and sleep are generated and regulated, and how modern life is disrupting this ancient and delicate biology. Professor Foster has published over 290 scientific papers and has received multiple national and international awards. His latest book, Lifetime: Your Body Clock and Its Essential Roles in Good Health and Sleep, unpacks the science of circadian rhythms and gives us guidance on how to use this knowledge to optimize our health. Russell shows us that the quality of our consciousness is largely defined by the quality of our sleep. His book is full of examples on how we can leverage our body clocks, the importance of light exposure, how to time our meals to boost metabolism, and he even shows us how taking medications at a certain time can combat certain conditions. By knowing the science that he shares and by embracing the ideas that he offers in this book, we all have an opportunity to be healthier, more creative, make better decisions, and be more present in our conversations and interactions with others. And as Russell says, it gives us the opportunity to view the world that we live in with a greater sense of wonder and curiosity. Russell, it is my pleasure to welcome you to Talks at Google.
Oh, Caitlin, it was what a fantastic introduction. Thank you so much. And I'm really delighted to be with you today. So shall I kick off with my presentation?
Absolutely. Thank you.
So can everybody see that okay? I guess so. Can I just check? I will come out of that and just make sure everybody you can see. That's good.
Yep.
As I mentioned, Caitlin, before we started, I've given a whole 50-minute talk to the void. And so I'm going to make sure that there's somebody out there. Great. Okay. So really what I want to talk about in the next half an hour or so is the critical importance of our biological clocks and sleep. And as Caitlin said so very generously, really this is sort of a talk that's come out of Lifetime, this new book, Your Body Clock and Its Essential Roles in Good Health and Sleep, published about a week ago by Yale University Press. I thought we could use our time together to cover quite a few things. So I'll give a sort of a general background on the regulation and generation of circadian rhythms. Then, really to illustrate how important biological timing is, I want to look at its impact on the timing, the impact on our cognition, the impact on stroke, cancer, immune function, and indeed drug development, which is an incredibly important but ignored area. And then think about how sleep and circadian rhythm disruption, or SCARD, can impact upon our health and well-being, both in general and our 24/7 society. And I'll dig a bit deeper on how SCARD impacts upon our information processing generally, our emotional processing, and this extraordinary relationship between mental illness and sleep and circadian rhythm disruption. Okay, so to state the obvious, but I do think it's worth really making this point, we sit on this extraordinary blue planet that revolves once every 24 hours. And of course, what that does is define two different ecological states, both nighttime and daytime. And what I find completely awesome is that all life, essentially all life on the planet, has evolved a response to these different states. And of course, it's a period in humans of sleep and physical inactivity, and a period of consciousness and physical activity. And just by stating this, it becomes so obvious that these different states require a different physiological underpinning. They're completely different. So if we look at our physiology, and we can say that the body clock, or our circadian system, anticipates the 24-hour light-dark cycle, and it adjusts or fine-tunes physiology in advance of the changing conditions. And that's illustrated really in the next slide. So each of these 6 boxes is a 24-hour time base from 2 p.m. to 2 p.m. And the gray area is roughly nighttime. Let's look at the changes in blood pressure to begin with, and then we'll look at these other changes. So what we see with blood pressure is that it drops in anticipation of inactivity and sleep, gets to a low point early in the morning, and then in anticipation of wake and activity and the need to get lots of oxygen and glucose to all the metabolizing tissues, it rises sharply. And we'll talk about the consequences of this fairly shortly. That's blood pressure. Anything you care to mention will show a similar dynamic change. Growth hormone is fascinating. It's not only used for growth, but of course, tissue repair, and that's largely released at the first half of the night. Core body temperature drops in anticipation of sleep. And in fact, the drop in core body temperature may well be necessary as part of going to sleep. But then in anticipation of increased metabolism, increased muscle efficiency, core body temperature rises and is high throughout the day. Cortisol, the stress hormone, rises in anticipation for that morning activity, so it peaks here. Testosterone, the male steroid hormone, is released during this morning window here. Not exactly sure why, but there's data to suggest that sperm quality is at its highest during this phase in the morning. And then our ability to process information goes to a low point in the early hours of the morning, rises and peaks in the late morning, early afternoon. And I'll dig into that in a little bit more detail as well. And the key point I want to make is for our bodies to work, we need the correct materials at the right concentration, delivered to the correct tissues and organs at the right time of day. And it's this coordination in time and space is achieved by our body clock or our circadian system. So let's look a little bit at the generation of our circadian rhythms. And we go into the brain, and we can expand this bit of the brain here, the hypothalamus. This is the pituitary gland here. This would be the optic nerve connecting to the eyes. And just as the optic chiasm, just as the optic nerves form the optic chiasm, they fuse, and just above, there's the suprachiasmatic nuclei. And this is the master clock within the brain. It's a truly awesome structure, something I worked on when I was based at the University of Virginia with Martin Ralph and Mike Menaker some years ago now. It comprises about 50,000 individual cells. And what's extraordinary about each of these cells is that they have the capacity to generate a 24-hour circadian rhythm. And I won't go into the details, but just to say, there are a bunch of clock genes which are activated and they produce clock proteins. Those clock proteins form a complex and then enter the nucleus and inhibit further clock gene activation, which means you then turn this system off, you lose the inhibition, and then, of course, the cycle starts again. And the net result, of course, is this wonderful 24-hour oscillation in protein production and degradation. And it's that signal that drives those 24-hour rhythms that I showed you at the introduction of this presentation. Okay. Now, we thought that this master clock, the suprachiasmatic nuclei, this SCN, was essentially forcing rhythmicity on our bodies. It was driving those 24-hour changes that I showed you. But what was incredibly exciting is that the discovery that every cell in the body has the capacity, like those master clock cells within the suprachiasmatic nuclei, has the capacity to generate a 24-hour oscillation. And so These are called peripheral clocks, and those rhythms that I talked about earlier, they are essentially under the control of these peripheral clocks. So that means billions of individual cellular oscillators organized throughout the organ systems of the body. So you've got this extraordinary hierarchy of time. So we are, in essence, a complete time-driven organism. And it's worth pointing out that changes in some of these clock genes are linked to a particular morning and evening sleep type. It's one of the great achievements, I think, in the field has been to show that tiny changes in some of these genes can lead to morningness and eveningness. Now, that's not the only part of what determines whether you're a morning or an evening person, but it's a very, very important contribution. Okay, I just want to also mention the key role of light. And really address the question is, how is the SCN entrained by light? And what I mean by that, of course, it's no good having a clock ticking away within the brain, trying to anticipate the rhythmic cycle of light and dark, unless it's adjusted, unless it's locked on to the light-dark cycle. And the key thing you need is an eye. And a lot of the stuff that we've been working on has how is the eye regulating the internal clock? And we work with individuals who have genetic diseases or as a result of trauma have lost their eyes. And it's a devastating condition because these individuals have lost their sense of time. And these are a couple of quotes. It feels like constant jet lag. I feel ill all the time. And another person, I'm at my wit's end, suffering from variable bedtimes and wake times. I'm slowly becoming socially isolated. So this is a really important part of our circadian organization, the capacity to detect the light-dark cycle and regulate our clock. So here we see our SCN again. And we know that there's a special projection from the eye via the optic nerve to the SCN. It's called the retina hypothalamic tract. Light, of course, is detected by the eye, and we need quite a bit of light. It's really important that the sort of light that we can comfortably read by is probably not enough in most cases to regulate the clock. So we need sort of hundreds to thousands of lux, the sort of light intensities you get outside for quite a long period of time, 30 minutes or more. So we need a robust light exposure. And we asked the question some years ago now, how the heck does the eye actually detect this dawn-dusk signal? So we're now going to expand the eye, and we see here the retina, and these are the rods and cones, the visual cells or the photoreceptors, which allow us to make an image of our world. This is the inner retina, where you have the first part of visual processing. And then these are the ganglion cells, which gather this information, and then of course it's the axons that of the ganglion cells that form the optic nerve. And we worked on mice originally and then humans, and to our amazement discovered that you don't need the visual cells at all. You have no visual light detection whatsoever, and you can still align the internal clock to the external world. And those discoveries led to the identification of another light sensor within the eye called a photosensitive retinal ganglion cell. About 1 out of every 100 of those ganglion cells that form the optic nerve is directly light sensitive using a special photopigment called melanopsin or OPN4. And it's these photosensitive retinal ganglion cells that allow us to align the internal day to the external world. This is what they look like. This is a low power shot of the retina of these cells, and they form this amazing photosensitive net spanning the arc of the eye. This is one at higher intensification. I'm clearly biased, but I think these are perhaps some of the most beautiful cells ever discovered. But then we can discuss that later. Okay. So let's now move to really the main topic of today's presentation, which is the importance of our circadian rhythms. And let's start with our ability to process information. So what we see here is a plot from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. And it shows essentially an improvement on our ability to perform a whole bunch of tasks, whether it be math tasks, multiplication speed, reaction times, drawing accuracy, problem solving, and memory recall. And you see a beautiful change. And for adults, our ability to process information is peaking in the late morning, early afternoon, so between 11 a.m. and 12 noon. So this would be a sensible time to apply your brain to the most difficult and demanding tasks that you may have to do during the day. Now, very interestingly, teenagers are a bit different from adults. They peak later. In fact, there's about a 2-hour delay in cognitive abilities between adults and teenagers. Now, why is that important? Well, it's worth bearing in mind that traditionally the most so-called demanding subjects, such as maths and the sciences, are delivered first thing in the morning. And of course, first thing in the morning, the teachers are great, but of course, many students are still waking up. So actually, it would be more sensible to give those more demanding classes to the students a bit later on in the day. And in fact, exam success improves later in the day as well. So some important implications about our cognitive changes. And I'd like to emphasize that in the following slide. So we're now going to move from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. and then consider really the nighttime changes in our cognition. So we can add that extra bit here. And we're again looking at cognitive improvement. So the higher up on this scale, the better you are at performing these tasks. Now, what's extraordinary is at 4 a.m., our cognitive abilities would be pretty low, about -20. But what does that actually mean? Well, a lovely study by Drew Dawson in Australia compared cognitive abilities at this time of day with the impaired cognition that you have when you're legally drunk. I think this is a great study. You could imagine how he organized this. And what you see here is that when you're legally drunk, your cognitive abilities have dropped to -15. But at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, your cognitive abilities are -20. So if you take nothing from this presentation at all, other than the fact that if you're driving a car in these early hours of the morning, your ability to drive that car is worse than if you were legally drunk. And so no great surprise, accounting for traffic volume, this is the most dangerous time to be on the road. In the United States, it's been estimated that either 100,000 and some people estimate 300,000 crashes occur on the freeway as a result of loss of cognition and indeed falling asleep in these early hours of the morning. If we go now to consider stroke, which of course is an important, incredibly important area of health at the moment and increasingly so. In a major review of 31 studies and based upon almost 12,000 stroke patients of all subtypes of stroke, showed that there's a significant time of day effect. There was almost a 50% increase in the chances of a stroke, all types, between 6 a.m. and 12 noon compared to the rest of the day. And let me show you an illustration of that from the team in Oxford, in fact, Peter Rothwell's Oxford vascular study. So we see time of day on this axis and the frequency and the number of people having a stroke on this axis. And we see a very sharp window there, peaking between 6 a.m. and 12 noon. Okay, so knowing that this is the most dangerous time of the day in terms of having a stroke, what time should we take our antihypertensive, our stroke medication? Should we take it in the morning or the evening? Now, most of us are told to take it in the morning, but because drugs take a time to kick in fact, the latest data has shown that taking it in the evening before we go to bed is more effective at reducing the danger of stroke than if we take it first thing in the morning. And again, show me the data. This is a study over a 10 to 12 year period, and we have increased death on this axis. This group took their stroke medication at bedtime, and this stroke took their stroke medication after they wake up. You'll see a higher rate of death in the morning versus the bedtime taking of the antihypertensives, and it's not trivial. it's about a 50% difference in death rates after 10 years of study. So this is, again, really important stuff and is not mainstream taught by our healthcare practitioners. Let's look at another really important aspect, which is cancer. This is an early study, and I've chosen it deliberately because I really want to illustrate that this kind of knowledge has been around for some time. So this was published in 1993. It was a relatively small study. It compared about 118 children who received chemotherapy either in the morning or the evening. And these are 36 on the morning schedule in red and 82 on the evening schedule. And this, I think, these are extraordinary data. So the survival after the period of time that was looked at, and this is weeks from diagnosis, was very different from those that had the medication in the evening versus the morning. In fact, there was about 70% survival for the evening chemotherapy versus 35% for the morning chemotherapy. Really important stuff. Again, not routinely taken into account for these sorts of drugs. And one final example is ovarian cancer, and I should flag up Bill Heresky, who was really one of the pioneers in this area. And he had two treatment schedules, A and B. Same drugs, same concentration, different times. First of all, he looked at treatment complications. And you see that with Schedule B, there were higher rates of treatment complications than Schedule A. And so the key question was, do the complications contribute to survival after 5 years? And they certainly do. I think these data are also extraordinary. On Schedule A, about 45% survival after 5 years. Schedule B, 10% survival after 5 years. This is really important stuff. And again, we must take this into consideration going forward. Immune function. Every aspect of our immune response is being regulated by the circadian system. It's highly dynamic, and we can talk about those changes perhaps during the Q&A. I just want to give you one example, and this goes back to 2016 and was a study looking at vaccination against the influenza H1N1 virus in individuals 70 years of age. And they either had the treatment, the vaccination in the morning or in the afternoon. And these are the data. So the morning vaccination showed a really robust antibody response going from essentially 0 to 400. What about the afternoon group between 3 o'clock and 5 o'clock in the afternoon? A very big difference. In fact, there's about a 3-fold difference in antibody response compared to morning and afternoon. Whether this is going to also be the case for COVID-19, we don't know yet, but my colleagues at both Harvard and Oxford are looking into this time of day effect. Okay, morning, greater protection, afternoon, poorer protection with this particular vaccine. We don't know if this will map on to other vaccination strategies. Drug development. Of course, we are increasingly dependent on wonderful new drugs to sustain our health. And what we do, first of all, is work on mice to get a sense of whether the drugs will be effective or not. But it's really important to emphasize that mice are nocturnal and we are diurnal. And just to illustrate that point, our rhythms or mouse rhythms will be peaking at this time, and a human will be 12 hours later. So there's a big difference in the physiology between a mouse and a human, depending upon time of day. And there's a very interesting study produced a few years ago, which again, in 2020, was a drug that was being developed to improve survival after a stroke. And so here's our mouse data. And the first time this was tested, individuals had come into the lab during the daytime. They tested the drug at the beginning of the daytime and found that the drug was really good at reducing some of the effects of a stroke, improved survival. So they thought, aha, what we're going to do is we're going to give it to humans at the beginning of the day. And when they did that, it didn't work. And of course, as you see from these rhythms, the human physiology is a completely different state to the mouse physiology. So then people thought, well, hang on, I wonder if we give the drug to the mouse, not at the beginning of its sleep phase, but the beginning of its wake phase, what will happen? And it didn't work. So in that sense, mice and humans are exactly the same. Beginning of the wake phase, the drug didn't work. And what will happen at the beginning of the sleep phase? Of course, the drug works. So by not taking time of day into account when comparing a nocturnal mouse with a diurnal human, we could be missing some really important new drug discovery. Okay, so that's the importance of circadian timing. What I'd like to finish with is essentially working against our circadian rhythms and sleep, and consider this sleep and circadian rhythm disruption, or the shortened acronym for this we've called SCARD. And of course, many of us will have impaired and sleep-wake disruption. This can be short-term, whether we're sitting up all night doing an exam for a few days, or whether we're looking after our young children or whatever, or it may be as a result of 24/7 activities and shift work. But what I want to illustrate is the following, that the short-term impact of SCARD upon our emotional responses leads to increased mood fluctuations, irritability, anxiety, loss of empathy. You failed to pick up those social signals from friends and colleagues, increased levels of frustration, risk-taking and impulsivity, the failure to think about, stupid and unreflective things. A good example would be, yes, I can make that red stoplight. Well, of course you can't, but people who are tired tend to go for it. Negative salience, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, a negative view of the world. Increased stimulants such as caffeine, and they can be more powerful stimulants, and increased sedative use to try and reverse the effects of the stimulants. Alcohol, for example, but increasing use of a whole range of different sleeping tablets. And that can blend into illegal drug use, particularly amongst our young people. In terms of our cognitive responses, impairments in overall cognition. You can't multitask as effectively. Your memory consolidation has fallen. You haven't got attention or concentration. Your communication systems fail. Your decision-making ability is impaired, and I'll illustrate this in a moment. Your whole productivity, motor performance, social connectivity. So with these two sort of areas, all the wonderful things that make us human, our ability to view the world and provide important responses to a dynamic and complicated world, are impaired. And then the chronic or the long-term impact of SCARD, we start at one level, which is daytime sleepiness, microsleeps. Really important. Falling asleep at the wheel, for example. Lots of accidents have been associated with this. There's a study in the UK showing that 57% of junior doctors after the night shift had either had a motor vehicle crash or a near miss on the drive home. 57%. Cardiovascular disease, massively distorted stress responses, altered sensory thresholds, sometimes feeling chilled, infection and lowered immunity, high rates of cancer, metabolic abnormalities, diabetes 2, and obesity, and of course, depression and psychosis. Now, I could spend hours talking about all of these, but you're really relieved to know that I'm not going to. I'm just going to illustrate this table with a few examples. But let's again start with cancer, because I think this is such an important area. So a statement here, nurses who work night shifts have higher rates of breast, endometrial and colorectal cancers, and this risk increases with the time spent doing shift work. And I've given all these references here just to illustrate the fact it's not just one study somewhere. We see lots of references starting from 2001 all the way through to 2016, which have been really well controlled. And in fact, the evidence base now for the links between shift work and cancer have made the World Health Organization declare that shift work is a probable carcinogen. I think is really important point. And while we're talking about it, female flight attendants showed increased risk of breast cancer and malignant melanoma, and a study on Canadian and Norwegian male pilots showed that they had higher rates of prostate cancer. So it's not just women, it's also men. Now, you could raise the very reasonable criticism, well, if you're flying in a plane, you're going to get increased levels of ionizing radiation, and that's true. But what these studies have done is compare long-haul pilots, for example, versus short-haul pilots. So the same levels of ionizing radiation, but one would have massive SCARD, another would not. So they have been reasonably controlled for that potential confounder. It's also worth bearing in mind that stress as a result of sleep and circadian rhythm disruption affects the immune response. This is a dramatic study. One night without sleep has been shown to lower the activity of natural killer cells, which are really important in identifying and killing cancer cells, by as much as 28%. So you can see why long-term immune suppression as a result of stress, as a result of SCARD, can impact upon both levels of infection, of course, but also cancer. SCARD and information processing. This is a really important study by Jan Born's group, a few years old now, quite surprising. It feels like only yesterday he published these data. And what we get, he developed a problem-solving task. And essentially, this is the percentage of a particular group that solved the problem. So the first group were introduced to the task in the morning, and then they performed the task that afternoon. And you see that 20% of the group solved the problem. The next group were introduced to the task in the morning, but then did the task the following afternoon, but they were kept awake all night. They did not sleep. And interestingly, about 20% solved the problem. Of course, the really interesting group is introduced to the task in the morning, the next afternoon, with a normal night of sleep. 60 to 70% of the group were able to solve the problem. I think this is a remarkable source of data showing the importance of sleep and our ability to problem solve. So sleep promotes the ability to come up with novel solutions to complex problems. Another really important area is sleep and circadian rhythm disruption on emotional processing. This is, again, a wonderful study. And in this study, there are two groups. One group that were allowed to sleep normally, and another group who were sleep deprived for one night, and so had not slept for 36 hours prior to performing the task. And the task was to remember words with an emotional content. So positive words, happiness, joy, love; negative words, hate, crime, murder; neutral words such as cotton. So let's look at the data between the two groups when all the words are lumped together. So perhaps no great surprise, those who had not had a night of sleep showed a very significant or a significant drop in their ability to remember all these words, whether they were positive, negative, or neutral. Now let's divide it up on the basis of their emotional content. So neutral words, a loss of sleep showed a trend, but it wasn't significant to remember words. Again, what was so fascinating is that sleep deprivation showed a trend to remember fewer negative words, but it wasn't significant. What the data showed is that the massive failure, or rather the massive impact on sleep deprivation, was a huge failure to remember words with a positive content. And these data beautifully illustrate the fact that the tired brain remembers negative experiences and forgets the positive one. And so essentially one's whole worldview can be framed by the amount of sleep that you've had. And finally, I want to talk about sleep and circadian rhythm disruption and its links with mental illness. Now, I think this is, again, a really important area. This is a study published a decade ago showing that those individuals with the diagnosis of mental health problems also experience some form of clinically significant sleep disruption, SCARD, as we would call it. Now, in this study, it was 80%. We've looked at this in individuals with schizophrenia, insomnia. And in our experience, it's 100% of individuals are showing significant sleep and circadian rhythm disruption. Okay, what's going on? And with these sorts of observations and an increasing understanding of how sleep is generated within the brain, we came up with the following model. That sleep processes, and of course, when they're disrupted, we call it scarred. And those pathways within the brain, mental illness, that give rise to mental illness, they share common and overlapping neurotransmitter systems and brain circuits. So there's a common overlap between mental illness and sleep. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is that if there's a change in a neurotransmitter that predisposes you to mental illness, serotonin, dopamine, whatever, because the sleep systems draw from all the brain neurotransmitter systems, there will be an impact on sleep at some level, which can give rise to scarred. Now, as we've touched upon, scarred can have short and long-term consequences in emotional, cognitive, and physiological health, which can exacerbate the extent of the mental illness pathology. And of course, mental illness, via its psychosocial and physiological stress mechanisms that it activates, and perhaps a contribution from medication, can disrupt sleep. So you then get this overlap to begin with, and then this feedback loop, which exaggerates and makes the situation worse and worse and worse. And that made us think, well, hang on, can we think of sleep processes and the stabilization of sleep as a useful therapeutic target in mental illness? The final slide I will show you illustrates what we did. This is work done in Oxford by my colleague Dan Freeman. So these were individuals showing insomnia and having paranoia and hallucinatory experiences. And this is the control group. And the intervention here was sleep stabilization. And we can talk about the mechanisms later on. And the control group had no cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. And you see that the levels of paranoia in this case are identical. In the experimental group, this is the level of paranoia prior to treatment, and then after partial stabilization using cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, there was a beautiful and significant reduction in the level of paranoia. And I think these data are immensely exciting because what they represent is the fact that the sleep systems can represent a new therapeutic intervention for mental health. And psychiatry is beginning to pay attention to this work and integrating it within treatment paradigms. So exciting times ahead in the mental health space. To conclude, by understanding our circadian rhythms and sleep and working with this deep biology, we can enhance every aspect of our lives, not least our health. So I think we now have time for some discussion.
Thank you, Russell. That was absolutely outstanding. The data that you shared, your energy around it, my jaw hit the floor a few times there. Thank you so much for that. We do have some questions that came in that I would love to jump into. First question from Grace. What sets the clock, given that we have different time zones?
Oh, it's a great question, Grace. And in fact, of course, how we adjust our body clock to the new time zone is largely as a result of light. So experiencing light in the new time zone then allows the internal day to be aligned to the external day. And you may be asking, thinking, well, hang on, what about shift workers? Why don't they adjust? And again, it's light is the problem because they're working under relatively dim light in the workplace, in the factory, for example, then experience bright natural light on the journey home. And the clock thinks, aha, this is daytime, defers to the brighter light signal as being daytime, which of course it is. And that's why the night shift worker's clock is essentially set as to the same time as a day shift worker. So what they're having to do is override all of this biology saying, hey, you should actually be asleep, which is why it's so damaging.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Grace.
Our next question is from Vanessa. What about people who are night owls and do their best work at night, or early birds who get most of their work done before 10 a.m.? Is
Yeah.
this true, or is it just a personal adaptation?
Great question, Vanessa. And in fact, one of the reasons I wrote Lifetime was to really make the point very clear that we are all very different. And I got rather irritated with the whole "you must get 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep" and the screaming sergeant majors of sleep. And of course, it's fine. You can take an average, but an average is a average. It doesn't sort of encompass the whole sort of dynamic range of human behavior. You're quite right. There are morning people and evening people. I mentioned that part of this is genetics, but it also changes as we age. So about the age of 10, we want to go to bed later and later and later. And so by the time we're in our late teens, early 20s, and incidentally, men tend to go to bed later for longer compared to women, and women peak a little bit earlier than men. And that's our latest. And then from our late teens, early 20s, we move to a more morning chronotype. So the time where, late 50s, early 60s, we're getting up and going to bed at about the time we got up and went to bed when we were 10. But on average, it's a 2-hour difference. So asking a teenager to get up at 7 o'clock in the morning is a bit like asking an adult to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. So it's a big impact. So you've got genetics, you've got hormonal changes associated with the sex steroids as they rise sharply through puberty and then decline into old age. But there's several other important factors. I could go on forever, I apologize. But we must understand the importance of light. Dusk light delays the clock. Morning light advances the clock, makes us get up earlier and go to bed earlier. Now, when we all were agricultural workers and we got symmetrical exposure to morning light and evening light, we stayed on cue. We did a study a few years ago on university students around the world. It was so cool because what we found is that those with the owls, the later chronotypes, were missing morning light, which would have made them get up earlier and go to bed earlier, but were getting all the evening light. So they were shifted to a later time. So in addition to their genetics, their changing hormonal systems, they were getting light, which was nudging them to a later time. Now, that's good news, of course, because if you want to become a bit more of a morning person, you can set your alarm. Then you can get outside, experience bright natural light, or sit in front of a light box in the morning, and that will advance the clock. So it'll nudge you earlier in time. Now, of course, there's lots of other things like social media. If we're staying up half the night and doing social media, that will, of course, mean that we'll get very little nighttime sleep, means that we wake up. And again, problem with our teenagers, wake up really tired, struggle to school, fall asleep in class, go home, then take a 2-hour sleep. It's not a nap, it's a sleep. That late time sleep pushes back the sleep pressure that night, which means it's more difficult to get to sleep that night. So you can fall into a vicious circle of going to bed, going to sleep later, and longer naps. So yeah, it's complicated, it's dynamic, and we have to find the right pattern that works for us. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And we have time for a few more questions here. We got a lot of great questions coming in. Dan asked, how does the body's natural day-night rhythm affect those who live in the far north or south and go through periods of little or no daylight or little to no darkness?
Oh, it's such a brilliant question. And I'm going to sidestep it slightly and say that what happens in places like Tromsø in northern Norway, and I've had the privilege of going there, what a lot of people do during the winter, for example, is that the family piles into a room which is flooded with light from light boxes in the morning to set the clock. So they actually try and use artificial light to correct. Otherwise, you can get really a whole mass of circadian rhythm disruption, bad for health and all the rest of it. But where we've got a beautiful example of what happens in the wild is in Arctic reindeer. And Karl Stocken did this a few years ago now. And he showed that during the winter months, these reindeers they turn off their clocks. They have no 24-hour patterns at all. And so they basically, and that makes sense, of course, because they feed whenever the weather conditions will permit in that sort of bleak Arctic winter. But what about summer, when it's 2 months of constant light? And they also turn off their clocks. Again, there's no day-night signal, so there's nothing to align to. And more importantly, of course, they have to eat all the time during the summer so that they've got enough fat reserves to survive the winter. So animals that have been in the Arctic Circle for tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of years have evolved an adaptive response. Humans who've only moved up there relatively recently, we don't know. And I can hear you almost asking the question, well, what happens to the native peoples of northern Canada and in the Arctic Circle? And the answer is we don't know. And I think it would be very interesting to find out.
Thank you, Russell. I'm going to squeeze in one more question here because we've got so many coming in. Okay, so what are your thoughts on blue light filters in glasses and their effect on sleep?
So those photoreceptors we discovered are actually maximally sensitive to blue light. And so there's a whole industry that built up showing that they may be able to affect our behavior. Well, first of all, if you think about what blue glasses do, they permit blue light to enter the eye and filter out everything else. So they're not giving you more blue light. You get the same amount of blue light without the glasses. They're just making the light more blue. So from that perspective, I don't think they have much validity. Having said that, we're not absolutely sure, and blue light has been shown to increase alertness via those glasses. However, I think that where I stand at the moment is very much where there was a consensus paper produced by ophthalmologists in Australia and New Zealand, and they said there is no direct evidence for any impact of blue glasses, which is interesting. The jury's slightly out. We did some work a few years ago on whether you have ultraviolet blocking lenses for cataract transplants or blue blocking. There was a real worry that blue blocking lenses would filter out the blue light that is needed for the clock. That assumption is flawed. And actually the bottom line is those blue blocking lenses allowed more blue light through than a natural lens. And we found no difference between UV blocking and blue blocking lenses on sleep-wake timing in those individuals who had undergone cataract surgery. So I wouldn't be completely adamant, but I'd say we don't really have robust evidence at the moment that they're doing anything other than maybe a placebo effect, because many people do report that they have beneficial properties.
Amazing. Russell, thank you so much for your time. For all of our viewers who submitted questions that we didn't get to, I encourage you to pick up a copy of Russell's new book. Everyone that's listening should pick up a copy of your book. Russell, the work that you do is outstanding. Everything you shared with us here today is fascinating. And Talks at Google is so grateful for your time and for all of the insight that you have shared. It has been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a great fun. And I apologize for not being able to answer more of your questions. Perhaps we should get together and just do a Q&A at some point.
I agree. Thank you so much, Russell.
Great pleasure.